Welcome back. This October, myself and 9 other narrators have teamed up to read you 10 terrifying stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this year's Halloween special. When was the last time you went to the theater? The last time I went was the year 2003 on Halloween night. Yeah, I know, it's very cliche, but I am an actor in training and I had realised I hadn't been to a theatre to see a proper play yet. The only ones I had ever been to are the ones which I've had to go see with my college, or if I was actually in them. The play was called Don't Watch and was about a retired puppeteer, but that's all I really remember about the story. It was a Halloween special, so I figured it would be a horror genre. My friends and I got there early to grab the best seats as I was overly excited about my first theatre experience as an audience member. And of course I wanted to get one of the good seats. We took our seats in the front row, but there was a blank piece of paper on my seat, so I just took it off and sat there. We waited a good 15 minutes until the rest of the guests had started to arrive. A slow piano tune started to play as the audience took their seats. As everyone was seated, a loud scuffling sound came out of the speakers, as if someone was messing around with a microphone. The announcer started to speak with a creepy tone to his voice. It kind of sent chills down my spine. Make sure all mobile devices are turned off and please, no camera or recordings allowed during the performance for copyright purposes, and it also may put off the actor. Now sit back and enjoy the show. I noticed something strange about his announcement. May put off the actor, he said, suggesting this would be a one-man show, and in fact it was looking that way. The piano music stopped playing and the curtain lifted. There stood a pale man wearing a brown suit with a faded blue and white striped loose tie. Circus music began to play and he lifted up a doll-like puppet and started playing with it. I looked at my friends seated on either side of me to confirm that they were just as perplexed as I was, and found that they were all staring at the man in awe. He began to pace backwards and forward from left to right on the stage while still playing with the puppet. The man began to cry and weep, and to be honest I felt a bit uneasy watching it, but I was very intrigued. The man stopped in the middle of the stage after 5 minutes of repeating the pacing and weeping. He dropped the puppet on the floor and walked backstage. He returned immediately with a tall floor mirror and placed it in the middle of the stage, leaning against the backdrop. It was tilted up towards the back of the room. As I squinted to see the mirror, something was strange. I couldn't see the reflection of the back wall. I could just see a stage, as if the image in the mirror is what the audience could see. I was quite impressed. They really made the effects look convincing. At least, I hope there were effects. The man picked up his puppet and began to play with it again. But this time he stood up in front of the mirror and started to weep more loudly. The music changed suddenly back to the original piano tune which had played for a short time before the show began. I shuddered as a wave of uneasiness washed over me. I scanned the audience and saw that the actor had pretty much captivated everyone in the room apart from myself. My attention was on my surroundings. I was actually afraid that someone was going to jump out from behind because of the fact that this man was drawing people's attention to the front of the stage. The man stood in front of a mirror and wept whilst playing with his puppet for a good 10 minutes. And I started to wonder if this was the whole play, but nobody else seemed to be responding to it. I was getting a little bit bored, but definitely frightened. I whispered to my friends, I think I just want to leave, but nobody was paying attention. I started to get a bit frustrated and impatient, so I stood up and was about to get ready to leave. But as I stood up, every single audience member turned their heads and stared at me. Even the man on the stage turned his head. Not his body, but only his head, and looked at me. Obviously, I felt more uneasy and was unable to stand, so I slowly took my seat again and all the heads turned back to the attention of the actor. The man on the stage turned back to the mirror and started his repetitive movements. I looked behind me to find the exit so I could quickly leave without a fuss. I had my route ready, but as I turned back to look at the stage, the actor had gone. So had the backdrop, which was quite strange because the mirror was still there on the stage, standing on its own. But this time it was tilting down. Funny enough, it was facing me and I could see my reflection. I was so scared at this point that I was unable to move. I wanted to run to the exit so badly, but my body just didn't seem to want to budge. I stared into the mirror and something weird happened. I saw the actor in the reflection, and then he disappeared. I scrunched up my eyes and opened them wide again, to see myself staring towards the audience, almost as if I was standing on the stage. I looked behind me and it was pitch black. I looked ahead of me again, and it was like I was looking into the mirror that was on the stage, but I was in it. I was in the mirror looking out to the audience, and I was absolutely terrified. As I stared towards them, I saw myself sitting in the audience just looking up at the stage in awe, just like I saw everyone else when I was sitting in the audience. Then a shadow started to appear, and it was him, the actor. He stood in front of the mirror and started playing with his puppet and weeping again. Just like before, he looked straight into my eyes, and I fainted. I would hate to end the story on it was all just a dream, but I did in fact wake up in my bed. I looked at the calendar and it read 31st of October 2003, and I just froze. There was something written on the date, an event. I thought that has to be the play I had seen called Don't Watch, and of course it did say that, but something wasn't right. I checked my diary and the day before had said dress rehearsal. Nothing really seemed to make sense. I hadn't had any plays recently. It was the holidays. I started to get texts saying break a leg, good luck, and cannot wait to see the show, and I started to feel a bit sick. I drove to the theater and walked into the room where the play was. The stage was exactly as I saw it. No backdrop, and the mirror was standing on its own. I walked down to the front row, and there was the blank piece of paper on my seat. Although it wasn't blank, I turned it over and it said, reserved for the actor.
Susan and Ned were driving through a wooded, empty section of the highway. Lightning flashed, thunder roared. The sky went dark in the torrential downpour. "We'd better stop," said Susan. Ned nodded his head in agreement. He stepped on the brake, and suddenly the car started to slide on the slick pavement. They plunged off the road and slid to a halt at the bottom of an incline. Pale and shaking, Ned quickly turned to check if Susan was alright. When she nodded, Ned relaxed and looked through the rain-soaked windows. "I'm going to see how bad it is," he told Susan, and went out into the storm. She saw his blurry figure in the headlight, walking around in front of the car. A moment later, he jumped in beside her, soaking wet. "The car's not badly damaged, but we're wheel deep in mud," he said. "I'm going to have to go for help." Susan swallowed nervously. There would be no quick rescue here. He told her to turn off the headlights and lock the doors until he returned. Axe Murder Hollow. Although Ned hadn't said the name out loud, they both knew what he had been thinking when he told her to lock the car. This was the place where a man had once taken an axe and hacked his wife to death in a jealous rage over an alleged affair. Supposedly, the axe-wielding spirit of the husband continued to haunt this section of the road. Outside the car, Susan had heard a shriek, a loud thump, and a strange gurgling noise, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. Frightened, she shrank down into her seat. She sat in silence for a while, and then she noticed another sound. Bump, bump, bump. It was a soft sound, like something being blown in the wind. Suddenly, the car was illuminated by a bright light. An official-sounding voice told her to get out of the car. Ned must have found a police officer. Susan unlocked the door and stepped out of the car. As her eyes adjusted to the bright light, she saw it. Hanging by his feet from the tree next to the car was the dead body of Ned. His bloody throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. The wind swung his corpse back and forth so that it thumped against the tree. Bump, bump, bump. Susan screamed and ran towards the voice in the light. As she drew close, she realised the light was not coming from a flashlight. Standing there was the glowing figure of a man with a smile on his face and a large, solid and definitely real axe in his hands. She backed away from the glowing figure until she bumped into the car. "Playing around when my back was turned," the ghost whispered, stroking the sharp blade of the axe with his fingers. "You've been very naughty." The last thing she saw was the glint of the axe blade in the eerie, incandescent light.
I can see him out there. I know this game. Helpless, unsuspecting 20-something having a quiet night in while the folks are out of town. Sits down, about to watch a scary movie. The setup is just too perfect. The only chance I've got is getting the first strike in now. I'm not fucking going down like some two-dimensional aging stray trying to pretend they're a teenager. Tools. What have I got? Enough. I hope. A quick check to make sure that he's still there. Yep, he's going nowhere. I can see the mask and flowing black scream. The film about avoiding film cliches, and here I find myself stood right in front of one. The only thing between us now is the door. I'm sure he can hear my laboured breathing, my not as light as I'd like them to be footsteps. He rings the doorbell. Bastard! Trying to catch me unaware. I don't fucking think so. I can just about make his knife out. He's clutching it very close to his robe. It looks dull, tarnished. I could call it lifeless, I guess. But this all feels like too much of an omen. I edge my way back to the kitchen. The closest thing we've got to a weapon is the assortment of cooking knives. Fine. If it's a knife fight, then I'm gonna make the first lunge. I compose myself for a minute, breathing some of the ash from my lungs before stepping back into the living room so I can make my way to the door. He's at the window. Game over. It's now or never. The police never get here in time. The knife is in my hand. Its weight isn't nearly as reassuring as I hoped it would be. The handle is moist in my sweaty palms. I'm just trembling so much I think that I'm going to drop it from behind my back. I'm going to give my game up. This is it. My heart is beating straight through my ribcage as I reach for the door. No fear, if you're going to go down fighting. I wonder if this is how that every man on the point of no return felt. How they feel before breaching a room or something. How the brave souls of D-Day felt as they were climbing into their boats. Death. Unavoidable. Anyway, I twist the lock. The door swings freely with a push. I taste the air. He stops. The knife. I've never felt anything like it. The snag as it first hit him. The grind as it connected with the bone. The touch of the rope as my hand had finished driving home my defence, my salvation. It was over. It took me a few seconds to react. I didn't know if it was enough. I stared back into those black holes for eyes, and I saw nothing. Everything in me wanted me to burst out. He sways. A groan comes from behind his mask. I smell the coppery smell of blood. He falls. I stand there, trying to will the life back into my limbs. This is the part where they catch you. Dead, sure. Dead just long enough that you've got your guard down. I drag him to the chopping block round the back and make sure that he's not coming back. It's all over. I go back inside, I wash up. I cry. I cry a lot. I feel like I've just been lifted from hell. Jesus wrapping a hand around my wrist when I most needed it. I've never been the religious type. Maybe that all changed at that moment. My heart drops. Right back down into the pit where I just felt like I'd lifted from. There's another knock on the back door. The doorbell ringing. I peer outside. I see a group of children. Some teens dressed as farmers. One's a priest. One's a king. One looks like he's just been tended to some more corn on a field. Religious fanatics haunted by their deranged belief. 5 of them. Well, there may be more of them, but that means nothing. I've done this once. It's time for the sequel. I twist the lock. The door swings freely with a push. I taste the air. Trick or treat. Yep, I'm not falling for that one.
During October 30th at 11:59 at night, go outside. Draw an oval into the dirt with your hands. If you use any tools, it will not work. Place your phone on vibrate and set it in the middle of the shape. You must keep focus on the phone, because if you look away, there's a good chance it might vanish. Did I not mention? Something wants to stop you. You can't see it. You can't touch it. It can see you, but not touch you. Try not to take much note of that. At 12:15 you should receive a call from a private number. Don't answer. No one knows what happens, but there's a good chance you will die. Again, take no note of that. After a while, you should receive a text from the same number. It's safe to read. It will disclose a number which is safe to call. Call it, and make sure to keep it on speaker, for remember, you can't break focus. If you call it, some man with a deep, raspy voice will answer. It will be silent for a minute or two, but he will ask you for your address. Tell him, it's okay, you need to. He will agree to send you a package 2 nights later at 11:59 PM. They will, as soon as the clock strikes 11:59, they will appear without warning, except to knock on the door. If you open the door, you will find a package. It is sealed tight in a blank cardboard box. If you open it, you will find a small radio. Put in the batteries that will come with it. They will last you a year. At 12:15, tune the radio to AM 11.1. The man will speak in a deep mumble, untranslatable. You will feel a slight headache, but don't stop listening. He will get louder, and your headache will grow more painful as he progresses. Don't stop listening. At 12:25 exactly, he will stop. A joyful tune will play. Your headache is gone. As long as the radio plays, somewhere you hold dearest, such as your house or car, will gain endless amounts of good luck. It doesn't matter if you can hear it or not. You will win every sport you play. You pass every test you take. You will win every bet you make. You are undefeatable. But one day, you will hear a loud pop. Start running. The batteries are dead. The thing can see now, and touch you. It will stop you now, and all you can do is keep running. It will get you eventually. In time.
Halloween used to be my favourite holiday. Every year, I'd decorate the outside of the house and buy loads of candy to hand out to the trick-or-treaters that came to my door. As much as I used to love it, I won't be participating anymore after last year. It was shortly after 9:30 PM and I had just sat down to watch a horror movie on TV. I wasn't too surprised when the doorbell rang. I was pretty well known among the neighbourhood kids for buying too much candy, and it wasn't unusual for a few to stop by at my house on the way home to see if I would add some more to their heavy pillowcases. I paused the movie, grabbed the bowl of candy, and opened the door. The first thing that went through my head was that this kid's costume was amazing. His mask looked like a large weathered goat skull. I wondered how he could see through the lights in the eye holes that glowed red, but appreciated the effect created by modern marvels used for creative costumes. He wore a black robe that was so big on him that it bunched on the ground at his feet and completely covered his hands. I would have been a bit freaked out immediately if I hadn't stood about a foot taller than him. After appreciating his costume for a moment, I opened the screen door and presented the bowl of candy, while telling him how much I loved his costume. His whole head tilted down to gaze at the treats for a moment, before he looked back at me. I started to feel a little freaked out at this point. This kid hadn't said a word, and I had that feeling like he was staring through me. We stared at each other for close to a minute, before I let out a nervous chuckle. "Alright kid, you got me. The costume's great, but I have a movie waiting for me in here that I really want to watch. Take some candy and go visit Mrs. Thompson down the street. I bet you'll make her piss her pants with that act." He didn't even look at the bowl as I pushed it towards him. He looked me straight in the eye as he took a step forward and knocked it to the ground. I started to reach for the bowl and spew profanity, but before I could do either one, the kid reached out and grabbed my arm. That's when I realized it wasn't a kid. The hand tightly grasping my bicep was rotting. Cracked brown nails tipped grey wrinkled fingers attached to a hand with oozing sores so deep that I could see bone. I wrenched my arm out of its grasp and scurried back through the door into my house, slamming it as the thing rushed forward and turning the deadbolt. It started pounding on the door so hard that it shook in the frame, and I feared the wood would splinter as I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed 911. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way and was telling me that she would stay on the line with me until they got there. When the pounding stopped, I went to the window and used my sweat-covered, shaking hand to pull down the blind just enough to peek outside. It stood in my front yard, staring at the house with eyes that glowed and pulsed like fire. The thing was no longer the size of a child. It was now almost half as tall as the utility pole at the edge of the yard. I backed away from the window and told the operator where it had moved to and what it was doing. She informed me that the police would be there in a few minutes. I stared at the blinds while I waited, painfully aware of what stood on the other side, and terrified that it wouldn't stay there. I heard what sounded like strong wind howling outside, and the house began to shake. The lights flickered as pictures fell off the wall and books fell off the shelf. The windows exploded with such force that the blinds were ripped from the wall, and shards of glass flew through the room. I screamed as I dove to the floor, lifting my arm to protect my face. I scrambled to the couch and sat behind it. It didn't offer much protection, but it was better than nothing. It suddenly became stifling hot in my living room. The putrid smell of death filled the air, and I gagged as I tried to tell the operator what was happening. Sweat poured off my forehead, and my shirt quickly became soaked. I felt exhausted all of a sudden, like I hadn't slept in months. Whispers filled my ears as I struggled to keep my eyes open. They told me horrible things, how they would rip my organs from my body one by one. I dropped the phone to the floor and covered my ears, desperate to block out the voices. But it was no use. They grew louder and louder until whispers turned to screams. All I wanted to do was drift to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw grotesque images. I witnessed children ripped limb from limb, a man's skin blister and melt away as he burned into nothing. Despite their overwhelming desire to close, I forced my eyes open. I wept as I held my hands so tightly over my ears that my head began to throb. The voices were no longer speaking. They had developed into guttural screams. I forced myself to stand and started making my way to the back door. My body felt 100 pounds heavier, making it hard to move my feet that were heavier than cinder blocks. I had just made it to the doorway between the living room and the kitchen when I had an overwhelming desire to turn around. Leaning against the doorway, I looked behind me. The thing was standing at the open window, bent over with its decaying hands resting on the sill. A long, thick tongue lolled from its open mouth, and blood slowly dripped from the tip. Although the face was bone, it seemed like it was smiling. Its eyes burned into me as a deep chuckle joined the chorus of screams. I began walking toward it against my will. I tried to stop, but something was pulling me along. As I passed the couch, I grabbed it and held on with all of my strength. I dug my nails into the fabric and screamed so hard that I felt something pop in my throat. My own legs tried to move towards certain death, while my upper body fought for my life. My hands and arms ached at the effort. I let out a desperate yell as my fingers lost the battle, and I once again began approaching my attacker. No matter how hard I willed my legs to stop moving, they took step after step until I reached the window. I stood mere inches away from this monster, trying my damnedest not to look at its face. It reached across the space between us, touching its foul-smelling hand to my chin and forcing me to meet its gaze. As its eyes met mine, all of the bad went away. The putrid smell, the blistering heat, even the fear slipped away. I was no longer afraid that I was about to die. I knew the thing was going to kill me, and I was okay with it. The creature removed its hand from my face and stood straight. I stood there mesmerized by it, unable to move even if I had wanted to. It opened its robes, revealing dozens of tortured faces pressing out from the skin of its chest and stomach. Their eyes were shut tight, and their mouths were opened as wide as possible in expressions of agony and terror. My content feeling disappeared in an instant as the thing's hand grasped the back of my head and began pulling me towards the faces in its belly. I tried to pull away, fighting against its grip. I put my hands against the window frame and pushed away from it. The creature placed its other hand on the back of my head as well. I shut my eyes and put my foot on the wall below the window, putting all of my strength into getting away from the faces that were writhing beneath its skin. Just as I thought I was going to lose the battle, its grip broke, and I fell to the floor. The monster let out a frustrated howl and moved away from the window. I sat on the floor amidst pieces of glass and knocked over possessions, and prayed that help would come soon. I didn't know what the police could do against something like this, but just the thought that they were coming brought me some sort of hope. Just as I started wondering how long it would take the cops to arrive, I heard a blood-curdling scream come from outside. The creature was back in the middle of my yard, holding a woman by the back of the neck, while examining a small dog that was held in its other hand. I could hear the woman pleading with it, begging it to let her go. It threw the dog, which landed against my car in the driveway, then quickly pushed the woman into its stomach. I screamed as I watched it absorb her entire body, head to toe. Once she was gone, a new face joined the others that pressed outwards, as if trying to escape their prison. It turned to me then, watching me intently, as it closed the front of its robes. I sank to the floor. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. I stayed there, in that position, staring at the broken window, where I was sure I would see my doom come for me once again. I don't know how long I sat there, but I was snapped out of a daze by a knock on the door. I rose to my feet and answered it, carefully peering through the peephole to make sure it was the police before doing so. The officer was saying something, but I didn't hear it. I was too busy staring at the circle of flames that was burning the ground in my front yard and the scorched earth that filled the centre. That was where the black robe lay in a crumpled heap, with the goat skull mask sitting on top.
I loved trick-or-treating when I was younger. Now that Halloween is coming up, I want to share the story with all of you. I advise you to be accompanied by an adult when you are out at night on the 31st. When I was 12, I decided to go trick-or-treating with my friends. I was supposed to go with 2 other people, but one of them canceled because she broke her arm the night before. It was just going to be me and my friend Allie. Allie was small for her age. She had brunette hair, wore glasses, was thin, and overall, she looked like an easy target. We decided to dress up as witches, and we wore a heavy black dress, a big hat, and we carried a broomstick and a small cauldron for candy. At around 6:30 p.m., she showed up at my house, and we headed out. By that time, it was getting dark, but we were too cool to have our parents come along with us. My mom wanted to, but eventually I convinced her that I was old and mature. "Just be careful, Everberry," she said, "and don't come home too late." I should have listened to her. For the first hour, we had so much fun. Allie and I wore sneakers so we could run to more houses and get more candy. Thank God we wore sneakers that night. Eventually we lost track of time, and the lights on the houses started to turn off. Allie was worried, so she said, "Let's go home." "Not yet," I replied. "There are a few more houses down the street, you see?" She decided to check her watch and she said, "It's already 9:30 p.m., Eva Berry." She had such a pleading look on her face, so we reluctantly walked back. But wait, where were we? It was too dark to tell. "Let's go to that house over there, and maybe we'll get directions." I pointed to an average-looking house, and the lights in there were still turned on. Allie agreed, and we lugged our heavy cauldrons down the sidewalk. When we rang the doorbell, no one answered. Just as we were about to turn around and leave, we heard timid footsteps coming down the stairs. "Someone's coming," I whispered. The door slowly creaked open, and an old woman who wore heavy makeup appeared. "Oh, trick-or-treaters," she said happily. Trick or treat, we said to the nice lady. Beside her was a big bowl of unwrapped hard candy. Weird, I thought. She dropped a large handful in each of our bags. I decided to throw it away later. Why don't you eat one now? I bet you kids are tired from running around. It's okay, Allie replied. We exchanged nervous glances. We just want to know which street we're on right now, I said. Eat one and I'll tell you, she responded nonchalantly. No, we already ate a lot before, said Allie. Her face twisted in a sour expression, and she stepped out of the house, closing the door behind her. Then she proceeded to ask us a bunch of questions, like where we lived, if our parents were with us. She asked us if she could take a picture of us. Allie and I were uncomfortable, and we stepped back. Suddenly, the monster grabbed Allie's unsuspecting wrist. Don't be rude, she seethed. Allie was paralyzed in fear. Let her go, I screamed. I looked around to see if anyone was nearby, but no one was. She opened her door and started to drag Allie in. Then I remembered that I was holding a heavy cauldron full of candy, so I swung it at her face. Narrowly avoiding Allie's head, Allie dropped her candy and we both ran as fast as we could. Allie and I were both on a track team, so we were pretty fast. As I turned my head back to look, I could see that lady was running behind us. I must have guessed her age wrong because she was gaining on us. This time, she was holding up a sharp knife. I threw my cauldron in the air. I sucked at every sport except for running, so I wasn't expecting the cauldron to hit the side of her head. But it did, and it knocked her out. Allie and I never stopped running, and eventually we reached the local elementary school. From there, we were able to find our way home. When I got to my house, my mom was enraged. How could you come home so late? Don't you know that's dangerous? She screamed. Then I burst into tears. She had a very confused look on her face. Why are you crying? She demanded. In my best attempt, I explained the story in gibberish. After a while, I managed to calm down and we called the police. Allie and her dad came down to our house, and together we explained what the crazy lady looked like. Our story made it to the local paper and the lady was caught. Someone had found her laying unconsciously on a sidewalk that night. The police investigated her home and found journal entries with explicit content in it, like how she enjoyed the feeling of murdering young children and then eating them. They found human flesh in her freezer. Apparently, she had a history of mental illness, and they discovered that she had killed 6 children so far. Today, I am thankful for the giant cauldron. If it weren't for that stroke of luck, Allie and I would have been cannibalized.
I was 13 years old when I stopped trick-or-treating. The other kids weren't so eager to give up free candy, but something happened that year. Something awful. My friends Owen, Drew, and I were out trekking for candy when we came to a house that had a big bowl of it sitting on the porch. A sign above it read, "Please take just one." We joked about swiping it all, but Owen and Drew only took a few each, enough to make them feel like badass kids. I'd always been afraid to take more than one, because I was intimidated by authority. Sure, it was just a sign, and it usually meant that the owner wasn't home, but I was a timid kid who always did what he was told. Owen and Drew explained how that house did the same thing every year, and that people rarely saw the guy who lived there. They dared me to do what they were too chicken to, so I decided to see what it felt like to do something naughty. We looked around to make sure no one was watching, and I poured the contents of the bowl into my bag. The 3 of us ran down the street laughing and shoving each other. Part of me expected someone to chase after us. In hindsight, I was right to be concerned. At Owen's house, we dumped out and sorted all our yummy treasures. I tried to offer him and Drew some of the contraband candy,
but they refused. I remember Owen saying, "That's all you, dude," and Drew shouting, "I don't want your tainted treats." Granted, they weren't entirely serious, but I was annoyed that they weren't sharing in the responsibility, enough to go home instead of sleeping over. That night I was torn from a sugar-fueled dream by a hand over my mouth and a knife to my neck. The skin was rough and the blade was ice cold. It was just slightly pressed into my skin, ready to slit my throat at a moment's notice. My body went stiff. I wanted to scream, but then a gruff voice whispered, "Don't make a fucking sound." At first, I didn't realize what was happening. Were we being burglarized? Then I got my answer. "Can't you read, you little shit?" The sign said, "Just one. Just fucking one." I'll never forget those words and the sickening smell of his breath. He went on to explain how every year he would catch kids taking 2 or 3 pieces of candy, which always infuriated him. It wasn't until I took the entire bowl that he finally snapped. Why did I do something so stupid? I was terrified and humiliated at the same time. "You like candy, you little shit?" he asked me. So I shook my head as much as I could, despite his hand pressing against my face. He then removed it, still holding the knife to my neck, and proceeded to shove unwrapped candy into my mouth. I tried not to inhale, but I couldn't help it. I could feel things pushing against the back of my throat as I whimpered and drooled. I started to gag, but he put his hand back over my mouth so I wouldn't cough up anything. I truly believed I was going to die, and I feared for my friends as well. My short life flashed quickly before my eyes. All I could think in that moment was, how could an adult hate children this much? Everything I presumed about them was suddenly a lie. They weren't infallible, and their authority wasn't always law. Fine, so I took all this guy's candy. Did I really deserve to die? As I contemplated this for the first time, expecting to suffocate to death, my father rushed into the room, grabbed my metal desk chair, and beat the living daylights out of the guy. I never loved my dad so much as I did that night. I'm an adult now, and I live in a nice house on a quiet street with lots of kids. Every Halloween, I leave a basket on my front stoop full of candy with a sign that reads, "Take as many as you want."
I'm a 29-year-old male who has held down a large variety of jobs. Some of these jobs have brought me into contact with some terrible people, some unbelievably creepy people, and a handful of outright scary individuals. It was late 2011 and I was working as a cab driver in my hometown of Midland, Ontario. Now, Midland is a sketchy town as is, and we have a few mysteries. One of the biggest ones is the disappearance of a young man named Jake Just on Halloween of 1998. Jake was 18 and had been partying pretty hard with his friends. At some point, he decided it would be an amazing idea to break beer bottles over his head. This got him ejected from the party, so he and his cohorts started walking home. As you can imagine, Jake was bleeding pretty bad, so the group decided to knock on random doors for help. They were allowed in by a few good Samaritans, and Jake went to clean up in their bathroom. Last anyone saw of Jake was when he asked for a few towels to soak up the blood. When the towels were brought to the bathroom, Jake had jumped out the bathroom window. No one is certain what happened to him. Close friends had stated that Jake owed money for drugs and it was substantial. He also had quite a few enemies. He's now become a cautionary tale within the area. Now, I was dispatched to pick up a fare and bring them into town. The fare was a guy in his early 40s, dark hair and eyes. He got in and gave me his destination. He was pretty friendly, so we struck up a nice conversation. Eventually, he asked me how I ended up driving cabs, so I told him about how my daughter's mother left me for my best friend. "And you let him live?" the fare asked me. "Yeah, I won't beg a woman to be with me." "Still, that guy needs to be taught respect. If it had been me, I'd have made him disappear." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but my laugh fell flat when I saw that he was serious. What the hell did he mean? As if reading my mind, he said, "I would have beat him down with a few buddies, then cut that fucker into pieces." Seriously? I asked. I was super creeped out by this point. "Yeah, I've done it before. This stupid kid at a party one night, this fucker was breaking beer bottles over his head. It was all kinds of fucked up. It really pissed me and my friends off, so we followed him home from a party to his house in Sunnyside. We grabbed him from the bathroom. This kid had no chance. We dragged him into the marsh and beat the shit out of him. Before we knew it, the kid wasn't breathing. I arrived at his destination and I was completely on edge. This guy just confessed to beating a man to death. He got his cash ready and held it out. I took it reluctantly, not wanting to show any break in my demeanor. We settled up and he opened his door, but just before he got out, he looked at me. "I expect what we spoke about to stay in this cab." I nodded. "Of course." He nodded to me and slipped out of the cab. I never saw him again after this.
It was the summer of 1997 in Jacksonville, Illinois, when 8 children, all female and between the ages of 5 and 10, had mysteriously disappeared from the town. Investigators used the majority of their force, additional special forces in Chicago, sniffer dogs, and just about every possible eyewitness they could acquire from the town, which was a shockingly low amount when you combine the case of all 8 girls. Law enforcement declared a curfew for every child under the age of 16, recommended people only go out at late hours if it was extremely urgent, and anyone suspicious traveling around the town during the evening hours was brought into the station for questioning. However, evidence ended up futile and inconclusive, with the case eventually being declared cold by the end of the year. Eventually, 3 years later, the investigation was called back into the spotlight after a local Caucasian male by the name of David Almont had confessed to his role in the disappearance of all 8 girls to the Jacksonville Police Department. While he informed them of their disappearance, he was oddly reluctant and unresponsive when he was brought in for questioning by the police. The man had little of a criminal record, other than 2 parking tickets and a noise disturbance complaint by one of his neighbors. Other than that, though, he was well known around the town for preaching the words of how the one true God has spoken through him, and being the leader of what he described as a closed and inverted cult group. Anytime he was asked for the children's location, he would simply reply, "Buried." One day during August, after several weeks of vague answers and lackluster response, Mr. Almont came into the Jacksonville station carrying a plain, small, black hardback notebook with the title, "Done," written in white writing across the top. He handed it to one of the 2 officers questioning him and simply said in a quiet, monotonous tone, "When someone reads that book, he is satisfied," with a blank expression on his face. "I was simply serving the one true friend, unlike you." At this point, he had a somewhat satisfied grin on his face. Officer Foley, one of the officers questioning him, flicked through the notebook and found the following contents. 2 days after the evidence was brought in and analyzed, 8-year-old Sally Parker from Jacksonville, Illinois, was reported missing.
This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out because we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating, and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating. So that left me home alone with my brother, handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 o'clock, almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch, watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock on the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell could be knocking on our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. So I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with a hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way this guy was a trick-or-treater, because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pockets of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was going to open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door, and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy!" I shouted to him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded, and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man, since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now when I think back to this, I wish we would have called the police, because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen any details of his face. They went on a hunt for the man, but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched, but he could have gone in and taken what he wanted since her door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had the urge to murder. So, to the creepy crackhead Halloween slasher, let's not meet.